Game Boy Works presents Maru's Mission along with sincere apologies. It's always a small thrill whenever Game Boy Works brings us to a release with an actual gaming legacy behind it, versus some random forgotten one-off like SUNSOFT Grand Prix or, I don't know, card game. But it's even more of a thrill when that legacy adds up to a quality game. Something I'm afraid I can't say is the case with Jaleco's next handheld creation, Maru's Mission. Maru's Mission is a bizarre, sloppy mess of a game, one that seems to have been created with the hope that a single nifty graphical effect would make up for the fact that the rest of the game feels decidedly half-baked. But on the other hand, it does tie in with a long-running Jaleco legacy franchise, so that's something. If you'll think way back to the beginning of Game Boy Works 1990, you'll recall Jaleco's Game Boy debut, a pinball title called SHUUGOU Pinball Party. While it may have paled next to HAL's spectacular Revenge of the Gator so far as handheld pinball sims go, SHUUGOU did have one thing going for it: cameos by a wide range of Jaleco mascot characters. That same mindset seems to have guided the creation of Maru's Mission somewhat. This is not a particularly well-made game, but hey, beloved characters. Or rather, a beloved character, Jajamaru-kun. Maru's Mission shipped in Japan in September of 1990, under the name Oira Jajamaru, Sekai DAIBOUKEN, or roughly, Hey Jajamaru, a big adventure around the world. Maru's Mission was essentially the Jaleco equivalent of Super Mario Land, a chance for the company's biggest character to venture onto a new platform so players could enjoy his adventures on the go. Between 1985 and 1991, Jaleco released 5 different Jajamaru games on the Famicom. None of these Jajamaru titles made their way to the US though. The third game was supposed to come to America as Taro's Quest, and the 5th entry was apparently going to hit the States under the name Squashed. Both efforts fizzled out, and we went sans Jajamaru until the very first Famicom game showed up as a virtual console import selection for Wii about 10 years ago. So this is another case of a fairly well-known series in Japan that had almost no traction in the West during its peak era, similar to Falcom's Dragon Slayer from several episodes back. And, much as with Dragon Slayer, the Jajamaru games struggled for identity from release to release. The original game appears to have evolved from some early arcade-style platformers by UPL and Microcabin that appeared in the early to mid-80s under the name Ninja-kun. Jaleco distributed a couple of Ninja-kun arcade games, and they seem to have adopted the protagonist for their own derivative yet original works, renaming him Jajamaru-kun, but largely sticking to the original gameplay formula. This wasn't particularly uncommon at the time. You can see famous examples of a distributor spinning a licensed arcade title into new works in Midway's questionable PAC-MAN derivatives, or the divergence between Wonder Boy and Adventure Island. Actually, a closer comparison to the Jajamaru situation might be found in Star Soldier, which began as a Tekkon Tecmo creation and eventually became a Hudson mainstay. Jaleco's first Jajamaru-kun game took the form of a very simple platform game set in stages that were barely larger than a single screen, and very likely served as the inspiration for the guerrilla warfare levels of Bandai's Ninja Kid. In any case, they definitely inspired the very first Haggleman segment of Retro Game Challenge. The Jajamaru series basically chased every trend imaginable on Famicom. The second game became a scrolling platformer like Super Mario Bros., while the third game jumped on the Dragon Quest bandwagon despite having nothing in common with its predecessors. The fourth game turned out to be a Zelda clone, and we'll see a portable adaptation of that game in Game Boy Works 1991 with Ninja Taro, while the fifth and final game looks a heck of a lot like Super Mario Bros. 3 and Jaleco's own Wampum. In other words, there was not a lot of creative constancy at work in the Jajamaru-kun games. And that flighty approach to design likely accounts for the mediocrity of the series' portable debut. Maru's Mission draws most heavily on the second Jajamaru-kun game, taking the form of a side-scrolling platformer set in very similar environments. Where Maru's Mission stands apart from the Famicom games in the series is in its settings. As the game's Japanese title suggests, Maru's Mission sends Jajamaru around the world on a quest rather than taking place strictly in feudal Japan. As usual for the franchise, it's a quest to save a girl, Kori, also known as Sakura in Japan. You don't get to ride a giant frog around in this game, but you're still trying to rescue the same young woman from the same villain, and it's still kind of janky, so it's pretty much business as usual. The abducted Kori keeps getting shuttled back and forth across the globe under the supervision of various monsters. It seems like a lot of trouble to go to for a simple kidnapping, but it does at least mean Maru gets to see lots of different scenery. Each of the game's 6 stages contains both a mid-boss and a primary boss. The mid-boss usually gives you the weapon that's required to defeat his senpai once you beat them. That's loyalty for you. Maru, who despite appearing like a typical dippy 90s kid on the US box art, is very definitely a shuriken-chucking ninja in-game, defeats his foes with throwing stars and collects his dead enemies' souls for health upgrades along the way. It's more or less standard platforming design, and each stage has characters and occasionally mechanics that tie to a different region's mythology. For example, in Romania, your primary battle will be against Dracula, whom you fight after fighting through a bunch of Frankensteins and can only be destroyed with the garlic weapon provided by the Romanian mid-boss Wolfman. There are some amusing little details within the game's bestiary too. When you defeat a chimera, for example, it breaks into its component creatures, which you have to destroy individually. And that's about all the good there is to the game. Everything else about Maru's mission is kinda bad. Let's start with the obvious thing, which is the massive, constant, pervasive slowdown. We've seen some sluggish games on Game Boy before, but Maru's mission literally feels like it's running at half speed at all times. This game makes Gradius 3 seem like a turbocharged Twitch exercise. At least that game had that one high-speed obstacle zone. The sensation of slow motion is only exacerbated by Maru's floaty controls, which include a jump skill that appears to have no practical ceiling. The longer you hold down the jump button, the higher you jump, eventually going off the screen if you want. The game feels curiously unfinished in many respects. There are certain zones where you can stick to ceilings and play upside down, but inconsistently, even within the same area. The game is spectacularly easy most of the time thanks to the ease with which you can farm health. But then you'll reach bosses who erratically remain in their invincible attack modes almost indefinitely and whittle you down to 0 health with no chance of retaliation. Since the game doesn't include a continue feature of any sort, this means a start-to-finish playthrough can come to a sudden, surprising end if you have a run of bad luck against a late-game boss, because, whoops, you only get 1 life. The whole game feels weirdly random, like the way you can be whisked to the very first boss within seconds of starting the game for no apparent reason. And sometimes you have to shoot spear guns at sharks. Also, while you can collect temporary weapons to use against regular enemies, some useful, some not, the mandatory anti-boss weapons don't become available until you face the boss in question. Yet you still have to press select to activate those secondary weapons, despite the fact that they're only available and usable in that one space. There's a somewhat charming platformer lurking inside here, but it's so badly realized that there's no joy in playing it, especially when you constantly run the risk of getting stuck in a cheap, invincible boss pattern and being forced to start over from the beginning when you lose your single life. Somewhat strangely, Maru's mission is believed to have been programmed by Tosei. Now, Tosei has a pretty poor reputation, but we've seen quite a few Game Boy productions by Tosei, and all of them were more competent than this. It's a weird blip of lousiness from a studio that could at least be counted on to demonstrate some degree of technical skill, if not much imagination. On the plus side, the dialogue can be amusing on occasion, and the shimmering raster effect at the beginning of levels is kinda neat. On the whole though, there's not an awful lot to recommend Maru's mission unless you're simply determined to build a collection of Jajamaru-kun games for some reason. So Jajamaru-kun makes his long-awaited American debut here on Game Boy, and it's a hard pass. Next time on Game Boy Works, breathe easy for a week as we enjoy a welcome oasis of quality.